So we'll be talking about the continuous S&OP breaking the mold. I was wondering whether I should spell that M-O-U-L-D, because that's actually a key part of what we're going to be talking about, is how S&OP should really be changed given where we are, both in process and technology capabilities. With that, let's get started and discuss how S&OP really came to be defined. So this was in a book written by Dick Ling and Walter Goddard way back in 1989, all of 25 years ago. And in that time, you'll see that many companies have had a faltering attempt at trying to deploy S&OP. And even to this day, S&OP is a widely discussed topic. And yet it's something that people are still struggling to really comprehend and decide how they go about it. Now, if we discuss the processes by which people suggest S&OP should be performed, this is a very classic description of a five-stage step of arriving then at your executive meeting finally, where there's a sign-off. And descriptions of this type of process are very much about going through at a functional level each step at a time in order to be able to build up first the demand plan, and then you push it over to the supply plan, and then you do some supply reconciliation, demand supply reconciliation, and then finally take a few suggestions up to the executive meeting. And a consistent discussion point I hear is that this is focused very much on a family level or so-called volume level plan. There's some real issues that we see companies struggling with this description. First of all, it is sequential. So it requires a very measured process to gather the data and then do some level of demand planning, etc. But perhaps more importantly is the unidirectional nature of this, so that you move from the data gathering to demand planning to supply planning to the pre-meeting to the exec meeting. And then next month you start that all over. But if there's any real discrepancy along the way, it's very difficult to step backwards and go from the supply planning to demand planning. There is the pre-meeting where people try and discuss where the mismatches are and somewhat how to do about that. But it is very much a one-directional flow. It's also at a high level. And certainly for revenue, for corporate level forecasts, that's probably okay. But here, the real issue is when you get down into cost and constraints, those are always at the next level. So only doing a plan at the volume level tends to hide the fact that you have some real problems about delivering on time, on budget, not necessarily from revenue budget, from margin perspective. It's also highly manual, with people really putting a lot of sweat equity into that. It is slow, and that's why we often see, even today, some companies are talking about deploying a quarterly S&OP. In our mind, this is way too long an S&OP cycle. In many cases, we have customers who are running a weekly S&OP simply because the pace of business has changed so much. You can't possibly be running a quarterly S&OP. Admittedly, most companies today are running a monthly S&OP. Other point is it is unit-based. So many times we walk in and there is no financial forecast that is being included in the whole S&OP process. And the description doesn't necessarily require it, because IBP is termed to be the place where you really bring the financial plan into the discussion rather than actually at the S&OP level. And as I stated before, largely this ignores margin because it is performed at the high level. So these aren't just our opinions. This is where we have worked with many customers, and they have described some of these as key barriers to the adoption of S&OP. But a lot has changed in the 25 years since, first of all, Dick Ling wrote his book and Tom Wallace described the five-stage process. And for one thing, we see a huge increase in the number of middle-class consumers. You can see the diagram there of A.T. Kearney's predictions by 2005. But the key thing is, what does that mean to our supply chain? It's not just that there's been an increase in demand elsewhere, but it is in fact that while we've been going through a lot of outsourcing, at the same time, demand has expanded globally. So now any large company has to operate in many, many companies. We've been working with one company in the pharmaceutical space that has taken the number of countries it sells into from 5 to 75 in a matter of 5 years. So this is the degree of expansion on the market, and of course that adds a great deal of volatility into the supply chain. And when that volatility is being absorbed on the demand side, that is really where you need to be able to do a much more efficient S&OP process. Because, of course, the key thing about S&OP is it's about sales and operations planning. So a fundamental aspect is being able to bring those two sides of the house together in order to be able to decide how you're actually going to go to market, how you're going to satisfy that market demand, given that you have existing supply constraints, either material or capacity. So that's why this particular slide is important, because of the demand volatility that imposes on the rest of the supply chain. But then when we look at some key technologies and what has happened over the last 25 years, we can see that S&OP was defined in, well, late 1980s. But, you know, the original description, because the book came out in 1989, but of course, Dick Ling and others had been working on the process for some time before that. So the original description was in the early 1980s. And at that time, there was still DOS and VisiCalc. SAP was green screen. Oracle was a database and had no applications. So that's a long time back. But then we see Excel really coming to the forefront in the 1980s, with Windows 95 and SAP APO only in the late 1990s. With the dot-com boom really causing some havoc in the early 2000s, and the iPad in the late 2000s. So we can see from a technology perspective, things have moved radically during that period of time where S&OP was first defined in the early 1980s. And in the meantime, we see a lot of other capabilities that people have been talking around on the supply chain. And if we look at supply chain collaboration, at the heart of the description of S&OP is the fact that there needs to be some internal collaboration. But as companies have outsourced, as they've gone into many different countries and therefore worked through distribution partners, there's need for external collaboration, because that is what then is driving both your demand signal and your supply signal. And S&OP is about matching those two things and understanding where you're going to have a profitable satisfaction of demand. So there's been a great change. But it's not only that. We look just over the last 10 years at cloud, social, mobile, and Internet of Things. We can see that there's been a huge increase in really collaborative platforms and how people actually interact and interrelate. And of course, this isn't directly related to supply chain. I personally think that this is going to have an effect on business fairly soon. But at the moment, we don't see too much that's directly related to business. But most certainly, what it's doing, as much as mobile phones did and smart devices, and now, you know, bring your own device type of views and work, eventually this type of collaboration is going to change the way in which we actually perform our businesses and our business transactions. But we can see that LinkedIn was defined in 2003, launched, and Facebook as late as 2006. And the iPhone, that has had a radical impact, well, it only came in June 2007. And tablets came out only in 2010, and with the iPad being launched in 2011. So there's been a tremendous change in the technology, which then enables people to perform the S&OP process far more effectively in that period of time. And then if we think about the Internet of Things and cloud computing, that is where we're going to be seeing a huge impact on our capabilities to actually perform the S&OP cycle far more quickly. Because it is about absorbing that information, about being able to analyze it quickly, understand what that is actually telling us from a demand variability perspective, and then being able to translate that back into your supply chain. But even from the purchasing side of commodity purchases and even some key material purchases, understanding what is happening in certain disease areas such as the Ebola virus. How is that going to affect some key minerals coming out of Africa which go into many PCs? These are things that really need to be considered, and this is where cloud computing and mobile computing are really going to have some effect. And then if we look at truly the Internet of Things, this now is about the machines telling us how they're performing, what throughput they've actually achieved. Smart warehouses being able to inform people about the actual inventory levels at a touch of a button. So you don't have to wait so much for that data to flow into your system. That data is available at every time and all of the time. So you don't have to go through very laborious and slow processes to go and analyze that data before you can actually make a decision. These are some key changes that are occurring in the supply chain. Now, there'll be a number of other changes that come with the Internet of Things as well, and that is the ability for people to communicate. If you include the whole social aspect and think about how that is now going to allow people to actually collaborate across functional boundaries to start with, but more importantly across corporate boundaries, that is going to have a radical impact on the decision cycle that it takes to reach a conclusion, which is the core of what S&OP is all about. So if we look at disruptive technologies and their assumed impact on supply chain, this was a survey performed by SEM World, and they looked at many chief supply chain officers around the world. And we can see that most certainly what I've been talking about is largely accepted as going to be making a radical change in some cases, less so in some other cases. But we can see big data analytics, which is of course very much related to the Internet of Things and also to cloud, being able to then see what the impact is going to be on the supply chain. The digital supply chain, which is largely all about having, first of all, content in some areas of the industries, such as white goods, etc. The software is now approaching 50% of the cost of goods sold of some of those items that are being sold. And if you look at the failure rates, and many times it's more the boards and the software rather than mechanical devices such as the motor that are failing. But what that's also leading to is smart devices eventually when they get there, where a machine is, such as a washing machine, is going to be able to self-diagnose and send a signal back up the supply chain to the fact that it is in the process of failing. And we have some customers more in the B2B space where they've got smart machines servicing, for example, the internet, where those devices can actually self-diagnose and send the signals back to a corporate entity who can then actually send out either a technician or download a new version of the software to correct an issue, but then be able to do analysis across multiple machines to understand where all of those machines were manufactured, what versions of software they have, and go through automatic remedial correction of those problems, all from a corporate entity. So there's going to be a lot of change around that, which is related, of course, to the Internet of Things. Cloud computing to be able to get speed and of deployment and the aggregation of information is extremely important. And we see some of these other things like advanced robotics, 3D printing, where people are maybe thinking that it's going to take a little bit longer to really have a big disruption on the supply chain. But the key point of all of this is the statement made by Kevin O'Mara from SEM World. and that is that 2014 may be the year that marks the end of process dominance. And what he means by that is this very stagnant representation, particularly of S&OP, where everything is done in that cascade. And that what people need to do is be a lot more responsive, and that's where he's picking up now and articulating the true cost to serve for every order. Perhaps it's not every order in the S&OP sense, but it's very likely to be in that process where you're beginning to understand your demand. So if you want to penetrate a certain region, what does that mean in terms of your supply capability? But not analyzing this once a month or once a quarter. It's being able to understand this on a far more frequent basis is what he's really talking about. So breaking that process dominance of you've got to have a stable process, and you've got to define the process well up front, and you've got to execute the process in exactly the same way every month. These are some key things that SCM World is challenging. So, what is it that's preventing us from making maximum use of many of these things that are coming through? And it is largely this mental model that we defined in the 1990s. And the whole idea that planning and execution are two different things, and you should perform them separately. And to Gartner's credit, as long as 2006, they were talking about east-west and north-south, east-west being their definition of horizontal integration across functions such as demand planning, inventory planning, capacity planning, etc., which to a large extent is the heart of the operational planning level. But the north-south is then from strategy through to S&OP, through tactical planning, through to operational planning. They're talking about the need for all of that to be tightly tied together so that you are not seeing these as separate boundaries, but the fact that S&OP is working off the same information, but perhaps you're just looking at a slightly different time horizon. And another challenge here is, for example, why is S&OP hard defined as something that happens 18 months out? Because if you're running a new product introduction, my contention is, first of all, as you're beginning to see how that new product is taking off, you better be absorbing that information far more quickly than once a month in order to make corporate level decisions of trade-offs that need to be made in shortages of capacity or material or promotions to get the new product to move far more quickly. So running an S&OP cycle and a new product introduction that's once a month, to me, is woefully inadequate. But at the same time, if you've got other products that are highly stable, that they've been in the market for 5 years, that their market share has not changed much, it's a component that keeps them selling, then you can fairly much put it on autopilot and provide systems and automatic dashboards that will alert you to the fact when any of those stability metrics, such as its market share or its margin that you're beginning to achieve, or even the revenue that you're pulling from it, when those change at any time, then you need to go and take greater attention or pay greater attention to it. But in the meantime, you should be focusing on those items that are really causing disruption in your supply chain and possibly in your future revenue. And those are frequently the items that you're just introducing or the items that you end up life in. And those types of things should not be, in my opinion, run once a month. So when we look at the traditional S&OP description again, this is talking a little bit more about how we see S&OP and how we facilitate it with our solution rapid response. Then, this is the traditional 5-stage view that we see. And really, those processes are supported, as we said before, by Excel and PowerPoint. Those are largely, even by Gartner's measure, the most dominant mechanisms by which people are trying to deploy very early stage S&OP. But if we look at then all of the tools that are used to calculate the deep level information, that's the traditional planning tools such as APO and the JDA stack with I2 and Manugistics, SmartOps, which is now owned by SAP, and SteelWedge. So these are tools that kind of do each of those stages, such as the executive S&OP or the pre-S&OP, etc. But here's the problem that, say an executive comes in and says they want to increase demand in Asia by 5% to compensate for revenue drop in Europe, because Asia, as we know, is a growing market. Europe is struggling a little bit more to really show a lot of growth. So most certainly if you're going to see a drop in revenue in Europe, then very likely Asia is the one where you're going to try and increase revenue. So the executive is trying to balance this off, and you can see that they send off a signal to the demand planner. So they're trying to analyze all of the analysis of the last 12 months and existing marketing plans to see in which countries it makes most sense to increase that revenue. And is that through promotion planning, or is that spread across all product families? And is this related to a new product introduction? How exactly are they going to be able to generate a 5% increase in Asia? Which then leads to a supply manager and planner being able to analyze whether or not there's enough capacity to actually achieve that increase. Because the volumes might still be the same going into Europe, it's just that they cannot command the same price premium. So what's happening is the price is going down, but the volume is staying steady. So there still is consuming capacity in the factories and the same material capacity. So now if you're going to increase capacity in demand in Asia, then you've got to analyze whether or not you've got enough capacity. So when they finish, then of course there's inventory planning, and managers, they look at how much inventory should we keep and where should we keep and what's going to be excess and obsolete, and is there enough capacity, etc. But you can see all of the handoffs that need to cascade between these organizations, and then finally to the S&OP team. And do we have the right demand and supply balance? Will this meet the new revenue targets? All of these kinds of decisions have to be made by this organization as they cascade the information backwards and forwards across all of these different tools. And then they get to the what if, and what if the NPI takes off faster than they'd assumed? What is the impact then? But now if they're trying to run a what if of that sort, they've got to start running through all of those different solutions one at a time to try and achieve that result. And finally, they get it to the executive S&OP team to try and see if they can live with that revenue shortfall. And are there any other risks that haven't been considered at this point? What if Europe drops even further? And what if they push marketing emphasis to take marketing dollars away from Europe, and they promote the products far more aggressively in Asia? What's the impact going to be? And then finally, those are all things to be considered, but the executive says, well, what if we accelerate R&D by 6 months by spending more money on that? That means the new product is going to come out even sooner, and now the whole cycle has to begin. But you can see how all of these arrows are going back and forwards between those different solutions. And you can see it's no wonder that companies think in terms of months and quarters for S&OP, because there's so much handoff, there's so much hand carrying of data through Excel. And while Excel is a wonderfully flexible tool, if you email out a spreadsheet, and we know of one company that's doing this, where they email out a 25 megabyte file on a daily basis, which is great information to those people when they receive it, but the moment anybody changes information in that spreadsheet, all of the other people on that copy list are out of date. So now how do you reconcile all of those people's copies so that they're looking at the same pieces of information? That's a nightmare. And this is the key thing that many people are trying to do in S&OP, is say, what if we did this, what if we did that? And they're trying to support that in Excel with enormous sweat equity going into that, of people trying to then manipulate and coordinate those changes within Excel. So how we look at this is a little bit differently, in the fact that our solution can cover all of those steps in a single solution and keep that information always harmonious and always synchronized. So you do not need to change or notify the demand planner of a change in supply. That will happen automatically. You don't have to have a pre-S&OP meeting really, because the whole time a rapid response solution is looking to understand whether or not there's a demand-supply imbalance and telling people when there is one. So all of that is performed automatically across all of those barriers, which is fine, but then what about the extension across into your customers and your suppliers? This is a key thing, as I said, we're beginning to see as companies outsource and sell into many, many different countries. Then the manner in which they incorporate information from their distribution partners and from their contract manufacturers into the S&OP cycle is extremely important in terms of the cycle that they can actually perform. So being able to suck all of that information into a single instance and have that information always up to date. So you don't have to do data gathering. The data is being gathered. And okay, fine, people need to think about what promotions they need to run or whether or not they're going to be running or purchasing additional quantities of supply from the contract manufacturers or their suppliers. There needs to be thought, but the data is all there. You don't have to do the menial task of making sure all that data is synchronized. The data is always synchronized, which then allows you to have a much more performant process where you can achieve much better visibility to issues up and down the supply chain in the long term and the short term at the same time, not independently and not through different reports and not through static reports that are run on historical information. This is all about forward-looking statements of where will we be in 18 months' time, or 6 months, or 6 weeks, all within a single solution, so that if you're running a much more rapid S&OP cycle, you could still be looking out 10 years. We've got some customers who are looking out to 10 years in the pharmaceutical industry. Of course, that's specific to their industry, but many other people would maybe want to look out 3 years. The information is always available down to the level of granularity, but it can always be aggregated up, and changes at that distance out in time can always be performed at the family level with assumptions made about how that disaggregates down to the more detailed level. Because it is, again, I want to emphasize this, the costs are always related to the mix. And you know, as practitioners, that very often a volume level plan looks fine. In the meantime, the mix is changing the whole time, which is having a dramatic effect on the cost of actually delivering that product, because the mix might be moving away from a high margin product to a low margin product. It might be moving away from a product that requires little capacity to a product that requires lots of capacity. So these types of things are really important to capture in the S&OP cycle, which doesn't mean that all of the decision needs to be made there, but the point is you need to be able to navigate through those time horizons and through those product hierarchy descriptions seamlessly and quickly in order to be able to understand at the high level, at the volume level, how the overall supply chain is synchronized, but then be able to dig down into details to understand where the key barriers are, the constraints are for you being able to reach that revenue target or that margin target. This is absolutely necessary to be able to do that level of digging down. So in its highest and its most mature deployment, many people have talked about this being a control tower. Now, it's not just in the short term, control tower. Control tower is just as important in the long term, so that people understand how their launch ideas or their movement into new countries, or even a change in the structure of the supply chain, how that is going to be then affecting their launch processes for new products, or the fact that they're going to be changing the supplier. because these are more the decisions that get made or understood at the S&OP level rather than day-to-day demand satisfaction. Nevertheless, the idea is that all of this information is tied together because, as I said earlier on, during a launch of a new product, you probably want to have daily updates of how that product launch is progressing. And what we find very frequently, especially when we work in the pharmaceutical industry, is there might be a product that is reaching end of patent in one jurisdiction, but it has only just recently been approved in a different jurisdiction. So the same item from an API perspective is going downwards in one region and is going upwards in another region. So in those particular situations, running an S&OP once a month is just not enough. But this gets to my point again. If you look at the corporate level, they might just be looking at a product family, and for all intents and purposes, it looks fine. But if you don't understand the fact that in one country, one jurisdiction, you end of patent, and another jurisdiction, you have just got through to the process of approval for sale into that area, then you're going to be making incorrect decisions at the higher level S&OP description at the volume level. You need to have that detail to be able to manage those differences. And of course, not all products are in those stages. You're going to have very many stable products with maybe 5 years until end of patent across most of the jurisdictions, which is fine. Those products can be performed at a different cadence. But this is getting back to my point again that there's no one cadence across the entire organization. You should really be able to segment out your products depending on where they are in the different life cycles and different regions, and run a different S&OP cycle for each of them. So it really is being able to do things continuously and collaboratively. So that's the key point here, is the term continuous and collaborative. So continuous meaning the information's always available to you. It doesn't mean that you have to run an S&OP cycle every day. Essentially what it means is you need to run an S&OP cycle on demand when you need to. So those are those situations where you've got a stable product and it has been selling at fairly stable volumes and prices for the last 5-10 years. But now if the system detects the fact that those volumes are dropping, then maybe you need to reset the frequency with which you address the particular issues in that product. And you might not want to wait until the end of the month, the end of the quarter, to start taking action. You might want to bring that up much quicker so that you can actually understand very soon what the actual cause is of that product dropping off and bring it into discussion with the executives very early on so that they can take remedial action quickly. So what does good look like in our opinion? And what we mean by good is, what does a good S&OP look like? So I'll go back to Dick Ling, who wrote the first book on this, and this is in a later stage of his life where he wrote a book about the evolution of S&OP. And we can see what he's talking about at this point is a central tenet that we believe in is the range planning. So in the shorter term, you've got some detailed operational focus and you see all the fluctuations, etc. And you've got historical data that's providing trend and seasonality baseline so that you then have, to a large extent, some element of predictability or ability to do the upper bound and lower bound of possibilities of your demand, which then should be blown all the way through to your supply plans to then understand that if we hit the top side of demand, what does that mean in terms of our ability to deliver it? Does it make sense? Or should we actually stop promoting some products to avoid the fact that we're going to run out of inventory in order to be able to satisfy demand and actually save trade promotion dollars or euros or whatever currency you work in? So it's really about having an idea and that upper bound of what is our supply capability. On the bottom bound, it's clearly you're going to be meet a shortfall of revenue, But what is it then that you can do to mitigate that? Where should you be running promotions in order to be able to achieve that? But it's also setting up guardrails. As long as you work in roughly within those boundaries, then you are going in the right direction. But if now all of a sudden you find demand in certain regions or whatever is dropping out of that, either on the bottom side or top side, then that means you need to take much more quick action to be able to resolve the issue. So this is, absolutely strategic, and key to that is being able to, first of all, do the analysis, but also provide the multiple scenarios that allow you to understand what the impact is of the top side and bottom side, so that you can then understand all of the financial and operational risks associated with both scenarios. And the quicker you can do this analysis and the further forward you can understand the risks and opportunities, the better you're then going to put the supply chain in place to be able to meet demand. And one of the key reasons for really emphasizing this is that I'm continuously astounded by the fact that when you look at many of the top companies within the consumer packaged goods, and it's true for many other areas as well, but I only know of some data from a survey that's conducted once a year, that the CPG companies, the best performers, actually struggle to get forecast accuracy above 68% for, if you're measuring forecast accuracy by the item and by the customer and by the selling region. So once you get down into those monthly buckets, then that is where you begin to get a lot of true understanding of what your forecast variability and your forecast accuracy is. And that's 65, 68%. The poorer performers are just above 50%. So the key point about that is, unless you're bringing that information into your S&OP cycle and allowing the analysis and enabling the analysis to understand how you're actually going to perform against that variability of demand, you're not really satisfying the problems associated with S&OP. And I know for many, many years there have been many who pushed the idea of a single number plan. Well, and ultimately down at execution, you've got to manufacture something. But when you're still looking at the S&OP stages, there's no such thing as a one number plan. It is really about a set of plans, a set of ideas of where the business might go. And unless you're doing a much more robust analysis, and you see that term roughly right, not precisely wrong. So the precisely wrong idea is you've got one number forecast and you're going to commit to it, come heck or high water. But really the key point is that there's a range of possibilities around that, and you should be analyzing it and you should be understanding what the capabilities are. So you can see on the right-hand side what Dick Ling is suggesting there, an integrated set of assumptions, scenarios, and not a single set of numbers. So that word scenarios is really important because that comes to what-if analysis again. So unless you can run multiple scenarios, you'll not really get into the problems addressed by S&OP or addressing the issues that need to be addressed in S&OP. So we've got customers who are running as many as 1,000 scenarios. Now, not everybody touches those 1,000 scenarios, and many of those scenarios don't see the light of day. But this is where people are doing exploratory work to say, well, what if we did this? What would the impact be? Now, they might then look at that impact and say, wow, we cannot sell that, or it just doesn't make sense. There's no point in promoting that to the rest of the organization. And they can kill that scenario. But nevertheless, they've had the opportunity to go and test some idea and understand its impact on financial and operational metrics. But many of those scenarios are where people are trying to do that resolution between the demand and supply. So it's absolutely key capability to be able to do that. So it's definitely a focus on roughly right, not precisely wrong. So giving the company direction as opposed to giving a company a single number which is never going to be achieved. There's also the idea of the outside in, and of course this is something that Gartner has been promoting for many years, and you can see it's about getting insights from demand and understanding supply risk and product opportunities. But it's the key thing is in the middle about sensing, shaping, and profitable response around the innovation of new products and product launch and even the promotion of product. So sensing demand and understanding where it's going. So if you do that only once a month, my view in most companies, especially as you get outside of the large molecule with long supply lead times, back into maybe OTC and even some of the small molecules, that is just too long a period of time to run that demand sensing. Shaping is actually understanding what is selling and what your supply capability is, because it's no use promoting some product if you don't then have the supply capability to meet the demand that you've generated. On the other hand, you might have available supply in terms of work in process that you know that product is going to expire unless you start promoting some use of it, and therefore really should be informing how you're actually going to run the promotion and what emphasis you're going to place on the demand side to be able to pull that material through. And the profitable response is all related to the fact that if your forecast is wrong, let's say your forecast accuracy is 65%, that means that your supply plan cannot, by definition, be more than 65% accurate. So what do you do with that other 35% that comes through? Well, you can't keep all of that in inventory, because that would just be an enormous amount of inventory. Now, within life sciences, there's far more inventory than in any other industry, and largely that's due to regulatory pressure and other issues like that. But there definitely is an opportunity to reduce that inventory quite dramatically. And a large part of that is through profitable response. And that is when demand is actually different from what you'd anticipated. Your forecast was wrong, as it always is, but now you know what customers are actually ordering. How then do you understand how your supply picture needs to change in order to be able to satisfy that demand where it's actually coming in? And being able to do that by more than just keeping inventory or simply satisfying that demand by whatever means. And we know of customers within the life sciences industry where they have a very good mantra, which is every customer, every time. But the question is at what price? And being able to understand at least what the impact is, and then maybe looking at alternatives of being able to change that, that are key things that need to be addressed within the S&OP cycle. So really when we look at a mature S&OP, we're talking about lots more than simply those functions within your organization, but how are you working with the distributors, and not just the distributors, but with your affiliates, and how you get in an accurate understanding of what the real demand is and what their true inventory picture is, and being able to gather that and then bring it into the supply chain. Finance, we've got one customer where the supply lead time is anywhere between 12 and 18 months. So the product that they're producing or the work process they're producing now is going to be used for next year's financial period. So they need to understand the real cost of manufacturing the product this year, because that's going to have a major impact on the absorbed cost or the standard cost for next year when they're looking at finished product, finished drug product. So it's really important to bring finance in there, as well as in terms of trade promotion planning around some of the products closer to OTC, or even launch ideas and how much you're going to spend on launch. And then on your supply network, with so much of API, especially in small molecules now coming from India and China, then obviously having a much better idea of how that information is flowing back up the supply chain is extremely important, especially now with Fiducia and other regulatory climates coming into play, where the FDA and I believe the EDA is also going to start fining companies based upon product availability, or more correctly, product shortages. So having that visibility into the supply network to have much better understanding and early understanding of when there's going to be supply disruption, that's really important. And same thing with the innovation network, being able to tie clinical, regulatory, and commercial tightly together so that you've got a much better understanding of launch. Even if it's a stable API, you might be going into a new product, you might have a new expression, all of these types of things. It's, it's really important to capture as much of that revenue and margin as possible at product launch and not be caught surprised by a early or late regulatory approval. So being able to tie all of those organizations together. So it's getting a lot more complex than it was 25 years ago in terms of the number of organizations that need to be integrated in order to provide this. So really from our perspective, breaking the mold is about getting to continuous S&OP. It is about understanding the fact that it is about and, not or. And by that I mean it is a horizontal process with all of these functions working simultaneously, rather than the old cascaded process of gathering the data, doing the demand plan, doing the supply plan, reconciling it, etc. It's about all of those working together. It's about it being sales and operations. It is about it being concurrent. So as demand is being changed, you understand what the supply impact is. You don't have to wait until halfway through the cycle to understand that that demand cannot be satisfied, and now you've got to go through some big reconciliation process. It's about the immediacy of understanding if I promote that product or the product launch in that country, if it takes off as quickly as I anticipate, we are going to have a supply problem. You don't have to wait 2 or 3 weeks to find that out. So it is about these functions working currently, not sequentially. That's really important. Then event-driven. It's not just calendar-driven. I'm not trying to suggest that people shouldn't have regular S&OP cycles and regular executive S&OP meetings. Of course, you need some capability for discussion and exploration. But at the same time, as I mentioned before, if you've got a new product launch and you can see that it's either taking off quicker than you anticipated or that it's not taking off as quickly as you anticipated, why are you going to wait 1 month or 1 quarter to then get executive approval? Of course, you need to bring those people in very quickly. So it's through necessity. And you, as I mentioned before, you still want to have the discussion forum and that formal process of people getting together and discussing the issues. But the manner in which they're informed and the understanding they have of how you track into that S&OP plan should not be a once a month or once a quarter process. That should be really a daily process, which leads to effectiveness rather than purely efficiency, but it is effective and efficient. So it is identifying the issues early, it is leading to quick resolution, and it is ultimately pushing the organization to the financial performance that it's looking for. So what we see is that each process might in fact be still doing something of a cascade, but even then those processes are somewhat overlapped. So yes, you always need to sit back and say, okay, what is the historical data telling us? What are the trends telling us? So you see that's where you're doing financial performance or new product gates or supply performance analysis. You're getting some feeling of where the inventory gaps are or where you're beginning to run out of capacity based upon historical trends. But then you go in through the next stage of running together with everybody else is, some new supply scenarios or some new product scenarios. So from a financial perspective, well, what if we looked for greater gross margin rather than went after market share? How would that actually change the picture? And then there's the consensus process. But you can see there's a lot of overlap with these types of things because this is where you're beginning to run scenarios that actually loop across all of these functions. And I only have space in the screen for 4 functions. You could bring in more, for example, your distribution partners or your CMOs, and be able to understand how all of their impacts on our or feedback is having an impact on the overall S&OP process. And of course, the executive S&OP, as I mentioned before, yes, you still need to have that. You still need to go through the point of validating some big decisions with them. But a key thing that you can do with rapid responses during that meeting, you can actually run some additional scenarios or deep dive in one particular scenario that an executive had just had a brainstorm on, rather than the traditional approach of saying, okay, we need to gather the data, we need to analyze the demand, and we'll come back to you in a month. No, that executive needs that answer a lot quicker than within a month, and being able to do that within the cycle is really important. But then as you move in through that process, is you're getting continuous demand and supply and market input. You're understanding what's selling, what's not selling. You understand how you're executing against plan. So then being able to monitor that performance, what you'd intended to do, what you'd agreed to do within the S&OP cycle, and understand what your future risk is. And when you've identified that future risk, if it's fairly minor, okay, you don't have to tell the executives. You it's your job to try and deal with that. But when there's some major issue, a new product launch that's not taking off as you'd anticipated, I would suggest it really is important to bring that executive in much earlier than at the end of the month. So these are some of the key things that we're looking at there. So the continuous S&OP, most certainly you need to generate the plan. Everybody needs a plan against which they're going to operate. But then sense very quickly when that plan is not being met, identifying the future risk, making mid-cycle adjustments. And this is all about a key point of our strapline, is knowing sooner and acting faster. Because the faster you act when something is going awry, the smaller is going to be the impact and the better is going to be the outcome. Absolutely proven in many studies that's true. So key capabilities that we provide is the range planning, as I discussed before, really understanding what are the upsides and downsides and what are your supply capabilities, what are the risks associated with each of those. But also decision orchestration. So as you're going through that process, you're coming across issues that need to be addressed, being able to identify who else needs to be included in that decision, and then being able to actually make sure that people carry out their parts in a timely fashion and be able to capture all of their assumptions. And then there's business trade-off analysis. In supply chain, especially in longer-term S&OP, there's always a trade-off. You can always capture greater market by dropping your price dramatically or running a big trade promotion plan or something of that sort. But that's probably not going to meet your financial targets for margin and profitability. Same thing, you can always deliver to customer service, provided you've got a huge amount of inventory, but then you're facing expiry risk, and plus the fact is you've actually created product and used capacity that nobody's going to need. So the trade-off is really understanding those end-to-end impacts, which gets us to scenario planning, because you cannot do those business trade-off analysis without scenarios, and being able to run scenarios quickly and effectively to get that understanding. And assumption capture, because unless you've captured your assumptions and recorded them, people don't really know what it is that you're trying to achieve and why you made those assumptions and on what basis you made that conclusion that revenue could be increased by 5% in a particular region. So this is a lot about concurrent planning. Concurrent planning across time, so that those time horizons morph depending on the specifics of the business problem you're trying to achieve. The function that you're focused on, continuous across demand planning, inventory, capacity, and continuous through the hierarchy from the high-level financial planning through to true S&OP down to into tactical planning, but you're doing that navigation between the volume and mix plan seamlessly and continuously. So what does good look like? There are definitely quantitative measures that can be discussed. And we can see here from a Gartner study, if you look at advanced companies, they have a 7.5% advantage over, if you do the math there, it's, 4.1% advantage over the beginners in S&OP. So they're beginning to reduce their their supply chain costs dramatically. Gross profit, you can see all of these with a more mature S&OP process. They can improve those things dramatically. Forecast accuracy, just picking up some of these items, you can see that that's close to 4% increase. So quite a big difference in the performance between the more mature S&OPs and the people just starting out. So with that, I'd like to hand it over quickly for some questions, if there are any, Elisa. I'm not sure if you can see any and if people have actually posted any Q&A. But now's your opportunity. The ideas are available. Sorry, the Q&A side is open for you to ask.
So,
anything
Trevor,
that's come through, Elisa?
Yes. We do have a question from Jerry Saltzman, and you've touched on some aspects of it. But he has multiple questions. He says, S&OP is a management decision process. What companies are using mobile devices for S&OP? Who is sending the information and who receives it? And how are collaborative decisions made?
Okay, good question, Jerry. First of all, I hope you'll appreciate that I cannot necessarily name companies, especially of customers. That's often proprietary information. But I would say that where we do see most mature S&OP is within high-tech electronics and very often within the contract manufacturers, because these people are running off of much lower margins and therefore need to be much more responsive. And in those areas, there's most certainly, at this point, what's probably emerging is more the distribution of information, of reports. And what's just beginning to emerge is maybe then more senior executive management responding in some manner to that information using mobile devices. But this is a little bit in the early stages. And, you know, key part of my discussion has been the fact that we do need to get to that point. And, you know, just by me saying we need to get to that point is an indication of the fact that many companies are still struggling with using Excel-based 5-stage S&OP cycles. There's some more than Elisa? Elisa?
Oh, sorry, that's all we have for today, Trevor.
Okay, great. So thank you all for attending. Much appreciated. Elisa, I do understand that this will be recorded and available for later discussion and download.
Yes, this recording will be made available. Everyone will see the link to the recording following this webcast. And we invite you to join us for our next webcast, which is coming up on Thursday, December 11th. And the topic of that webcast will be end-to-end available to promise. Thanks, everyone.
And thank you very much, everyone.